Hey guys, I am Karat, also known as Cheese Enthusiast from the GetBlock.io team. And today I'm here to talk to you guys about Succint Non-Interactive Share Proofs, which was our hackathon project for ErgoHack V. Now, Succint Non-Interactive Share Proofs, also known as SNISPs, are really just a way to trustlessly calculate work and put that work on the blockchain. Now, SNISPs use a combination of traditional share calculation methods along with concepts from NEPAls in order to sort of compress the amount of work, the total set of shares that each miner creates, and put it on the blockchain. Now, using SNISPs, we can create efficient decentralized mining pools. Decentralized mining pools that have greater security and scalability compared to past methods. Now, before we dive into SNISPs, let's get some background knowledge. So let's look at how proof of work sort of functions. Now, in general, the way proof of work functions is that you have a miner who is essentially given some work that they must apply a hashing function to, and really, the miner usually creates, millions, billions of hashes every second. And they're doing this in order to eventually find a hash that satisfies this inequality here, so that h of w is less than t, which is the target value set by the blockchain itself. Now, this w value, it usually includes an incomplete block header along with a nonce chosen by the miner. And this random nonce value is used and incremented over time in order to create unique values of h of w that eventually satisfy the inequality. Now, pretty much all or almost all proof of work currencies use this inequality here. And this target value, t, is usually extremely low, and it's usually adjusted so that an average block time can be reached by the blockchain. And you can see that sort of as the target is increased, the probability of finding a block also increases, while as the target decreases, the probability of finding a block also decreases. So here's a little illustration to sort of visually represent what's happening when someone is mining for blocks. The way you can think of it is you have a blindfolded man throwing darts at a wall. And the goal for the blindfolded man is that they want a block below a certain height, which is going to be our target. And every time they throw a dart, it lands in a completely random spot. So you can see that your probability of getting a dart below this target value is pretty low. And in this case, the miner only found one. But the point is that you're essentially throwing random darts at this board until you get one that is eventually below the certain target value. And that dart, or in this case, hash, once it's below the target value, it's considered a success, or like a block. And you can also see that the range of values is huge. 2 to the 256 is a ginormous number. And the target is exceedingly low, so that your probability of getting a block is also exceedingly low, at least on your own. Now, this kind of shows you why mining pools are needed. And the reason mining pools are needed is because, as you can see, a single miner is unlikely to find a block or a hash below the target value. So instead, you could get multiple miners, all hashing or throwing blocks. And throwing darts. But really, the point is that if you have multiple miners, more darts are being thrown at this board, so you're more likely to get a dart below the target. So because of how low the target is, it makes sense to combine the computational power of multiple miners together in order to eventually find a block, and then split the block reward that you get for finding a block between all the miners according to the amount of work that each miner performed. And that's sort of really what a mining pool is. You're combining the computational power in order to find a block quicker and find blocks more consistently. So let's look at how a traditional mining pool works. And the way it works is that you have your miner with a GPU, and the GPU is receiving what are called jobs. And really the jobs is representing the W part of H of W is less than T. So miners are receiving this work from the pool to the GPUs. The GPU is iterating over the nodes and essentially creating a ton of hashes. Now, some of these hashes are going to be considered shares, and shares are what are used to calculate how much work each miner performs. Now, when a mining pool receives a ton of shares, they essentially use the shares and go through some share processing algorithm to create a share score, which is just some number that is proportional to the miner's payment on the blockchain. Now, let's talk about what a share really is. So shares are going to represent full block headers whose hash does not satisfy the standard proof of work inequality. So they're not going to satisfy this inequality here. Instead, they're going to satisfy an easier inequality provided by the pool operators. And instead of being H of W is less than T, it's going to be H of W is less than T of P, which is going to be some target set by the pool operators. And a hash being below this pool target is essentially what is going to represent a share. Now, in general, this pool target is going to be an easier inequality to solve compared to the block inequality. So you can see that T of P is going to be greater than T. Now, usually for miners, we don't use the target representation. We'll use the difficulty, which is sort of the inverse of the target, calculated by 2 to the 256 over the T. So when we refer to T of P, you may also know it as a stratum difficulty, and that is simply the difficulty representation of T of P. Now, in general, T of P is set by the pool operators. Usually there's only one stratum difficulty or T of P, but sometimes mining pools will have variable difficulty, or they will have different ports with different difficulty values. And really all that is about ensuring that not too many shares are sent over the network because there is a network load. But that's really the only reason that T of P may be different between different mining pools. And yeah, so that's sort of the difference between targets difficulties and T of P and the stratum difficulty. Now here's sort of an illustration, based off our last one, which is showing how shares and the like are being processed and found by a miner. So because the inequality set by T of P is easier than the inequality set by T, you can see that a miner is more likely to create a ton of shares rather than blocks. And essentially, mining pools will use all of these shares as they're submitted, take the number of them along with the stratum difficulty, and use that to essentially calculate how much work each miner performed. So let's look at the share processing algorithms that take these share values and convert them into a share score like we talked about above. So there's a few different algorithms that take the shares and create a share score, and the most basic one is the pay-per-share algorithm. So the way that pay-per-share algorithm works is that miners are essentially receiving scores proportionally according to the total amount of work they performed. So you can think of it as the number of shares multiplied by the share difficulty. And you can see that here. So n times 2 to the 256 over T of P. Now this 2 to the 256 over T of P is simply the stratum difficulty, and if you multiply that by the number of shares, you get each miner's share score. So that's really the most basic share processing algorithm. Now let's look at the PPLNS algorithm. So pay per last n shares. So this algorithm works a little bit differently, and it's something called pool hopping, which I won't really go into because it's not too relevant. But the point is that instead of evaluating all shares that a miner has submitted to the mining pool, instead we're going to only evaluate shares that were submitted within some period of shares submitted by the entire pool. So let's say a block is found. For the PPLNS algorithm, the only shares that will be considered valid are shares within the last n shares made by the mining pool. So let's say like a block is found, and there's some set of shares created before the block was found. The mining pool will only consider shares valid if they're within the last n shares submitted to the mining pool. So a common value for n is 50,000. So if your shares are not within the last 50,000 submitted to the mining pool, they won't be used inside the share processing algorithm. Really, we call this a window of n shares. Now, similarly, there's the PPLNT algorithm. Now, instead of using a window of n shares, the PPLNT algorithm uses a window of time. So let's say a block is found here. Instead of using n shares, we're going to use a window of time, W, and that window of time could be 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever it is. The point is that shares will only be used inside the share processing algorithm if they're within the window of time before the block was found. So let's look at why to use decentralized mining pools, because the share processing algorithms have existed for a while in different Bitcoin mining pools, etc. So the question is, why do we want decentralized mining pools? So the biggest thing is that decentralized mining pools pose less of a 51% attack threat. And that's simply because all of the hash power is not controlled by a single entity behind the mining pool. Instead, decentralized mining pools are, decentralized. There's no singular entity, so there's much less of a threat of a 51% attack on the blockchain itself. Similarly, no trust is really required within a decentralized mining pool. Now, because normal mining pools are, managed by a singular entity, there is trust required that your work is calculated correctly, and that nothing happened to your payment, etc. So really, in this decentralized mining pool, no trust is required compared to traditional mining pools. Now, let's look at the smart pool protocol, which is going to be our best model of a decentralized mining pool so far. The way smart pool works is it uses smart contracts in an interactive protocol to evaluate shares. Now, what does that mean? Here's a little representation of how the smart pool protocol works. So you have your miner, he mines some shares locally, and he takes all these shares and puts it within something called an authenticated dictionary. And you can usually represent this as some sort of tree using a hashing function, something like a Merkle tree or an AVL plus tree. And this tree is going to be called a share proof. Now the share proof is sent to this smart pool contract, which holds it and then asks the miner for a random share. The miner gets this message and then returns an authenticated dictionary proof of existence for that share within the actual share proof. If that share is verified, the smart pool creates a share score and then a payment on the blockchain. Now, this works pretty well. However, if you look at it, this is an interactive protocol. So it requires multiple transactions to go through by the miner. And that hurts scalability and profitability because transaction fees need to be paid and because multiple transactions are going through. So this is great, but let's try and get something that's more efficient because we need mining pools, or rather decentralized mining pools, to be scalable and efficient because there could be hundreds, thousands of miners on a single pool. And we don't want to use something that's inefficient, which will then cause delays in payouts and possibly hurt profitability due to transaction fees. So really what we want is something that looks like this. The miner simply sends a share proof to the pool contract, which ends up spitting out a score and finally becomes a payment on the blockchain. Now we know that using an authenticated dictionary of shares is not an option. We saw what happened using that with the smart pool protocol. It becomes an interactive protocol. Now at the same time, we need our share proofs to be succinct. Now authenticated dictionaries already solve this by themselves. They're inherently succinct, but we can't use an authenticated dictionary because we need the protocol to be non-interactive. So we need both non-interactivity and succinctness in order for our share proofs to really, get our goal, achieve our goal of being succinct and non-interactive, and therefore efficient. So how do we achieve these two goals? Now, if you remember, past share processing algorithms, you look at them, they all use n, which is the number of shares. Now, we don't want to use the number of shares per se because we need our share proofs to be succinct. So what can we do? What can we look at? Let's look at what are called NEPAls as inspiration for how we could sort of use different concepts to sort of compress the amount of work performed on the blockchain. Okay, so really what NEPAls are succinct, non-interactive proofs of work. And they can be used to prove blockchain predicates. So essentially events that occurred on the blockchain, or statements that can evaluate to true or false about the blockchain itself. Now the way NEPAls work is they use especially high difficulty blocks, which are called super blocks, and they use them as checkpoints on the work performed on the blockchain itself. Now if you think about it, because every time you hash a value, you'll essentially return a random value. Sometimes when you try to satisfy this h of w is less than t inequality, sometimes you'll get it right under the t value, and that'll be a normal block, but occasionally you'll get a hash value who is extremely below the target. And in that case, we'll call it a super block. Now, super blocks occur at different levels according to their difficulty or hash value. And because of that, different levels of super blocks, which are sort of determined by their difficulty, these different levels occur less frequently according to how high their difficulty is. Now, this property of super blocks occurring at an expected value on the blockchain is called goodness. And goodness is sort of the core property of a NEPAl. And a NEPAl shows goodness if the distribution of super blocks at different levels is at or near their expected mean. So here's a little illustration showing how NEPAls sort of work. And you have L0, which is all blocks, but you have L1 as well, which is all blocks that are greater than 2 times the difficulty, or essentially have a hash value that is 2 times below the current target. And all that means is that the block occurs 2 times less often compared to blocks at L0. Now, if you have blocks at L2, they occur 4 times less often compared to blocks at L0. And this is sort of determined by this h of w is less than t over 2 to the I inequality, where I is the level of the blockchain that you are trying to find goodness for. So you can see that this property of goodness works well, and it allows for succinct proofs, as well as non-interactive proofs. So let's see if we can kind of use the same concept on shares. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're pretty similar. For one, when miners are mining, they're using the same hash function in mining pools as they are using in normal solo mining. So really, it's the same inequality, but you're just using a different threshold. So for blocks, you're using T, and for mining pools, you're using T of P. So let's say then that we can extend the property of goodness to any set of hashes, or in our case, shares that a miner creates. So rather than attempt to involve the number of shares, let's simply use the share difficulty along with goodness to create share scores. So if you remember, past algorithms use the number of shares, like the PPS algorithm and PPLNS algorithm. They all use the number of shares to calculate how much work was performed. Instead, we're not going to do that. We're going to use the share difficulty and try and prove that the share set created by a miner is good. And if a miner creates a good share set, then they honestly mined. So instead of super blocks, we're going to use super shares instead. So really, the goal in the end is that miners are going to prove that their share set is good by providing a set of super shares that show that goodness was achieved for some constant number of shares at some chosen share difficulty. I'll get more into this last part in a bit, but the point is that this concept of goodness can be applied to shares as well, because shares, just like blocks, are random values or have random hash values associated with them. And because of that, you can use this property of goodness to compress the amount of work that a miner performed over their share set. Now let's start diving into SNISPs. So just to begin, all miners are going to be using different hash rates to create shares. And like we said, we want to ensure our proofs are succinct. So rather than evaluate miners by their number of shares, we'll set the number of shares to be a constant n. So what does that mean? That means two miners on the mining pool are going to be mining the same number of shares, ideally. So, miner 1 is going to mine n shares, and miner 2 is also going to mine n shares. That's regardless of their hash rate. Even if their hash rate is different, they're going to be mining the same number of shares. Now, because miners may have different hash rates associated with their computational power, some miners are probably going to be mining more shares than others, realistically. Now, to solve this problem, we're not going to use a constant target value like we use with T of P. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to let each miner choose how low they want their target to be. So we're going to call this target Ta. And what Ta is going to be is it's going to be the target chosen by the miner in order to essentially create n shares with their given hash rate. Now, in addition to that, we don't want miners submitting old shares, so we're going to, take one of those, one of the concepts we saw from the PPLNT algorithm. We're going to use a window of time W before the block was found to ensure that valid shares have to be made within a certain period of time. Now, just generally, you can see that to find the total work a miner performed for a block, you can simply multiply their hash rate by the window of time to see how many hashes they performed within the window of time itself. And because hash rate is limited by physical capabilities, it is hard to game the system. You can't really increase your hash rate artificially. So you can see that there's a GPU. It's creating some hashes within the W window. And those hashes are eventually filtered out so that only super shares remain. or rather just shares remain to create some share set. Following this inequality, h of w is less than ta. And as you can see, because of this inequality and the share set that we have, we'll eventually be able to prove that goodness exists within the share set and prove that a miner did their work honestly. Now, just to kind of go over this ta value because it's pretty important, let's think about two miners on our SNISP mining pool. Now, one miner is going to have 500 megahashes a second, and another miner is going to have 500 gigahashes per second. These are completely different values, and they're quite a few orders of magnitude apart. So this miner here is going to be creating a ton of more hashes than this miner within the same window of time. Now, because of that, this miner is likely to create a lot of shares if their ta values were the same. But really, we want our ta value to be adjusted so that each miner creates n shares within the window. So what does that look like? For the miner with 500 megahashes, they're probably going to have a higher value of ta. And the reasoning for that is because they have a smaller hash rate. So because they have a smaller hash rate, their value of ta is going to be higher, meaning that the threshold dividing hashes from shares is going to be easier to solve. The inequality h of w is less than ta is going to be easier to satisfy for this miner compared to this miner because their ta value is increased. On the flip side, for the miner with 500 gigahashes, they also want to mine n shares in total. So rather than use the same ta value as the 500 megahash miner, they're instead going to use a ta value that's lower. Because they create more hashes within the window, they can adjust their ta value to be lower in order to create the same number n shares within the entire window. So let's look at the second part of our SNISP protocol. We can think of our system as a game. And inside this game, miners will mine locally, creating a set of shares. Now, as you know, the number of shares a miner creates is limited by two things. Their chosen value of ta, which is the threshold dividing hashes from shares, along with their physical hardware, because their physical hardware has a certain hash rate associated with it. Now, once a block is found, miners must submit a SNISP to the pool contract to receive their share score. And now what a SNISP really is, it's going to be a set of super shares created from this set of shares. And the set of super shares is going to be used to prove goodness within the entire set of shares. Because the set of super shares is being used to prove goodness, we can essentially use that super share set to validate the work that the miner performed. Now, goodness has to be proved for a single level in our protocol, and we're going to be using the parameters n and ta to ensure that goodness exists. And a proof is only good if it contains exactly I super shares at level I. Now, once goodness is proven, a miner receives their difficulty as their share score. And we don't want excessively long proofs because we want our proofs to be succinct. So we're going to set a maximum level mu. And if goodness isn't proven, the miner gets a score of 0. So this is sort of the mathematical representation of what's happening. The miner creates a share set, which eventually becomes their super share set, which is going to represent their SNISP, their proof. Now, each proof is going to be at a certain level. Now, each share within the proof has to satisfy the inequality for that level. The inequality for that level is going to be S is less than ta times I divided by n. Now, you can see that this is slightly different from the leveling system used by NEPAl, which was here, h of w is less than t divided by 2 to the I. The reason for this difference is that we found this inequality to work better for our protocol, ta times I divided by n, but it might be good to do more research into how this one works as well for SNISPs. Regardless, the point is that goodness is evaluated using these inequalities, and in our protocol, the SNISP protocol, we're going to be setting a maximum level I. So unlike the NEPAl protocol where I sort of is unlimited, we're going to have a maximum level, and we're going to set that maximum level to be mu. Now, remember also that for a proof of level I, there needs to be exactly I shares within that proof, or rather, sorry, I super shares within that proof in order for goodness to be achieved. So, for a valid proof to exist, all shares within the proof at a certain level must satisfy this inequality. There must be exactly I super shares within a proof of level I in order for goodness to be achieved. Now this is a very mathematical representation of what's going on. One last point to make is that the share score is going to be equal to their difficulty. This is very important. So the difficulty will be 2 to the 256 over ta. So if the miner's proof is validated, they get this value, this difficulty value of ta, as their share score. Now, unlike previous share score algorithms or share processing algorithms, we don't include n. The reason for that is that n is now a protocol-wide constant, just like w, and just like mu as well, it's going to be a protocol-wide constant. And because every miner is going to be aiming to create n shares, there's no reason to include n within the share score algorithm. So really the only thing that's needed is this difficulty value. And that difficulty value of ta is going to represent your share score and essentially be proportional to your payment on the blockchain. Now, as I said, this is a very mathematical representation, so let's look at more of a visual representation to see how this works out. So this is how a traditional mining pool works. You can see that DFP is just the difficulty representation of TFP. And really what's going on here is you have two miners, M1 and M2, and the way their scores are evaluated is by the number of shares that they submitted. Because the share difficulty is constant for them, the height of all these shares, at least inside our visual representation, is always going to be the same. And they're really evaluated by the number of shares. So M1 created more shares than M2, so they get a higher score. Now, that's how a traditional pool works. Let's look at how a SNISP pool kind of works. Now, the way a SNISP pool works, rather than use the number of shares, the number of shares, in essence, is going to be equal. Each miner is going to be aiming to create n shares. However, to prove that they created n shares, each miner is going to create a set of super shares that prove goodness for a set of n shares at a certain level. So for miner 1, in this case, the miner created a proof at level I, where I equals 6. So a proof at level 6 for their share set. And they're using 6 super shares to prove that they created n shares at D. And D is simply the difficulty representation of ta. So if the miner created n shares at D, or rather D1 for miner 1, they will have a set of super shares to prove goodness for their entire share set. This is for miner 1. Miner 2, on the other hand, was able to create a SNISP with level 2. So that means only 2 super shares are needed. And because miner 2 has a lower hash rate, their value of D is going to be lower. And because of that, their SNISP needs to satisfy an easier inequality, D of 2 times n divided by I, rather than D of 1 times n divided by I. And because of that, simply the miner is paid less. And that's simply because the score is just equal to their difficulty. And because D1 is greater than D2, miner 1 gets paid more. Now keep in mind, these levels are arbitrary and they can be essentially chosen by the miner. So here's an example of miner 2 creating a different SNISP. In this case, they're using the same difficulty value, D of 2, but because level I is now equal to 6, the actual D2 times n divided by I is going to be lower. So the difficulty value for each super share can be lower compared to their proof for I equals 2. In the end, regardless of what proof miner 2 is submitting, they're paid the same because the score in the end is still D2 regardless of what level proof they submit. Now also remember, there is a maximum level that they can submit at, and that maximum level is mu. So with that in mind, let's look at the importance of this TA value and why really it is the most important parameter inside of our protocol. So a lower TA means a higher payout but more variability in rewards. And a higher TA means a lower payout but less variability in rewards. So with that said, there should be some ideal TA value which balances the payout and the variability in rewards out. And that ideal TA value is going to be different for each miner, because for each miner they're going to have essentially different values of TA so that they can still create n shares within the window. Because of the way TA is set up, in that increasing it too high means you get a lower payout, but decreasing it too low means you get variability in rewards, there's going to be an ideal TA value which balances these two things out. So just as a mathematical way of thinking about it, we can calculate the ideal TA value simply by performing this equation. And the equation is going to be n times, sorry, not n times, it should be n over h, which is going to be the hash rate of the miner, multiplied by the window of time, sorry about that. Right, so I actually made a mistake last time. It is actually h times w divided by n, then 2 to the 256 divided by this. So this will get the TA ideal value for a given miner, given the values of n and w, and given the miner's hash rate h. So let's try and calculate the ideal TA value for a miner with 500 megahashes. So 500 megahashes is really 500 times 10 to the 6th hashes per second. Now if you multiply that by, let's say the window is going to be 3600 seconds, so 1 hour. So it's going to be 5 times 500 times 10 to the 6 times 3600 divided by n. And let's say n equals 10,000. This right here would give you the difficulty representation of your ideal TAW value. So you could say it's your ideal difficulty. Then if you use the difficulty to target conversion by dividing the entire thing from 2 to the 256, you get your ideal TAW value. So as you can see, there is some ideal TAW value for each miner with a given hash rate. And because n and w are going to be the same for all miners on the pool, you can easily calculate your ideal TAW. Now, the goal of the ideal TAW value is to balance out the higher payout and the variability in rewards. So let's imagine that these boards from our past representation of mining, they represent our miner with 500 megahashes. So let's see what happens if the miner sets the TAW value too high. Now to explain this a little bit, TAW is obviously the TAW value, and this is the limit for hashes versus shares. So if your hash is below TAW, it's considered a share. Now TAW divided by n is the max share proof. Now what does that mean exactly? If you remember, the inequality we set for our SNISPs is going to be h of w is less than TAW times I divided by n. So because of that, if I is 1, that means h of w simply needs to be TAW divided by n. And because for a SNISP to be considered valid, it needs exactly I shares inside of it, what TAW divided by n represents is the threshold at which you only need one share below in order to create a valid SNISP. So really, you only need one share below this yellow line to create a valid SNISP. Now you could have no shares below it and still create a valid SNISP, but this is the limit at which exactly one share is needed, or rather one super share, because it is exceedingly below TAW. Now let's look at what happens for a miner, and this is going to be for a higher value of TAW, higher than their TAW ideal. So for this miner, their TAW value is quite a bit higher than their TAW ideal. What that means is their hashes are more likely to be shares and really more likely to be super shares. So this miner right here, given their value of TAW, can easily create a SNISP. Because of that, because they're easily able to create a SNISP, but because their TAW value is also very high, their share score, which is based on their difficulty, ends up being quite low. So they did get a SNISP very easily, but their payment is quite low. Now, let's see what happens with their ideal TAW value. And you can see with the ideal TAW value, quite a bit less hashes are considered shares, or even super shares now. But the payout has increased. And really, the goal is to balance out your viability of creating SNISPs with your total amount of payout based on your TAW value. And here we're going to say this is the TAW ideal. And because of that, this miner was able to perfectly balance out variability in payouts with their payment. Now, let's look at what happens when someone creates a SNISP, but their TAW value is way too low and way too hard to satisfy the SNISP inequality. Here, the TAW value is extremely low. Because of that, the miner was only really able to create a single share. And this single share is not below the TAW divided by n limit that allows for a single share to be submitted as part of the SNISP. So in this case, the miner did not create a valid proof at all. They're unable to prove goodness for their share set. Because of that, because their TAW value is so low, they don't get a valid proof, and actually they get 0. That's why it's grayed out here. Now theoretically, if they did get, let's say, a hash here, then they would have gotten paid this large amount of ERG, but because it's very unlikely, they're not really likely to get a valid proof too often. And this sort of balancing out between payouts and variability in rewards sort of makes all miners in the pool tend towards their ideal TAW value, and essentially tend towards being honest, because by being honest, they're more likely to prove that their share set is good, while also maximizing their profitability. So let's finally look at what a SNISP pool really looks like. Now in a SNISP pool, miners will commit to their ideal TAW values. Because the way these parameters are set up is that miners are inherently incentivized to mine near their ideal TAW. Now, just to clarify a little bit, the ideal TAW value might be different for everybody, not just because of hash rate, but because some people have different risk to reward ratios that they feel comfortable with. So maybe someone wants to risk a little bit and get a slightly higher reward by decreasing their TAW value a little bit below their ideal TAW. That's okay. Similarly, some people may be less willing to risk payouts, so they'll increase their TAW value, which means they get a slightly lower payout, but more safety in terms of how often a valid SNISP is generated. That's all okay. The goal in the end is to have miners tend towards their ideal TAW, and slight differences are okay in the end. So going back here, what does a SNISP pool look like? And initially, miners will have to commit to their ideal TAW values. And this commitment to their ideal TAW is pretty important. It does sort of break the non-interactivity that we wanted, but because they only have to interact with the SNISP pool once to do it, it's not too big of a deal. It's only one extra transaction rather than an extra transaction every time a proof is sent. Now, in a SNISP pool, a miner only has to mine to their own node because the pool itself is on the blockchain. SNISPs are going to be submitted to a smart contract for verification, just like the smart pool protocol, but it is a little bit different because it is non-interactive for the most part. Now, SNISPs are going to remain succinct, and the only interaction, as we said, that's necessary is the initial commitment to their ideal TAW value. So this is going to be the first part where the miner commits to their ideal TAW. And because the miner knows their hash rate and it's a stable value, the miner can easily commit to their ideal TAW value because they'll know it beforehand based on the equation that we gave, which is over here. Now, once committed to their ideal TAW value, miners can start locally creating shares. They can, once the block is found, they can extract all the super shares within their set of shares within the window, and then create a SNISP by extracting super shares at a certain level between the inequality 1 is less than I is less than or equal to mu. So they can create a share proof at a certain level I. That will be their SNISP, which they sent to the SNISP pool. The SNISP pool can easily verify the SNISP just by checking if it is good, and if it is good, the miner receives a score and a payment on the blockchain. And really, that's the core of the SNISP protocol and how it really works. So miners are committing to their ideal TA value, and then eventually creating SNISPs using that ideal TA. And those SNISPs are sent to the pool contract to eventually be verified and show up as a payment on the blockchain in the end. And that's really about it for this sort of presentation on SNISPs. If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments and I can try and answer them. Yeah, that's about it, guys. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll come back next Ergo Summit and teach you guys about something else.